Welcome to Sociology 102, Police Violence, Black Lives Matter, and the COVID-19 Pandemic. This is the start of a series of videos that will be publicly available. And we're doing this so that we can provide a service to the public in a time where we need a little bit more than what we're seeing on the newsreels. We need a sociological understanding of what's going on. And when I say that, uh, I'm talking about some very specific things. So here you're going to hear not about what we think ought to happen, although there'll be some of that, but you'll hear a lot about how we know what we know and just how much we don't know. And so you'll encounter a discussion of network analysis and how we can use network analysis to do predictive policing, but on the police. How we can predict who's more likely to shoot an unarmed civilian. We can also step into the shoes of the police officers themselves, look at how they're trained, and see how honorable people can sometimes do dishonorable things, under what conditions and what might be done about it. We can look at the Black Lives Matter movement. We can look at history. We can run experiments. We'll see some experiments run in this course so that we can understand why the Black Lives Matter movement protests are more or less likely to be persuasive, more or less likely to be seen favorably by a general public. And finally, we'll go to the COVID-19 pandemic, and we'll see how race is bound up with health, but not in ways that you might think. And we'll try to understand why we're seeing the unequal distributions that we are in terms of outcomes from the COVID-19 pandemic. The course will begin and end with James Baldwin, who was not a sociologist, but who thought sociologically. And so we will bookend the course with the conversation with Professor Claude here at Princeton, chairing the African American Studies program, and talk about his new book, Begin Again, and how we can take lessons from James Baldwin's America and apply them to our own. And of course, today on the syllabus, you'll see that we're going to read a piece from 1966 by Baldwin. This is a report from occupied territory. So that's the course. We hope that you'll join us, and we hope that you will take heart. The social sciences are engaged in these questions, and we hope in a way that will make our lives better. In order to practice full disclosure, I always like to explain exactly what my own interactions have been with the police. And so what you'll see is that I've had both positive and negative interactions with police. And then as we go along in this course, we're going to try to determine what might be some of the determinants of these positive and negative interactions that are outside of anything that I did as an individual. So we will be thinking about individual behaviors, yes, but as sociologists, we're looking at what's happening that's outside of the individual that is making some outcomes more likely than others. And so my tale of police encounters begins in the southeast of England in the spring of 1991. I was young then. I was on an English-speaking union fellowship to the UK, studying A-levels at a British boarding school that's about twice as old as the United States is, more than. And so it was like something out of a movie set, really. And while there, spring break came along, and I had a big red backpack and headed down to see my friend Steve. Steve was staying at his grandparents' house, and he didn't have a car, but he had a bike. So he came to the platform of the train station on his bike and decided that he could just walk along with this bike with me, and we would just walk the long, dark road to get to his grandparents' house. As we're walking, if you knew Steve, you know that he's this rugby player, very square jaw, big guy, flaming red hair. He's hard to miss. And in this particular town, where I don't think I saw any other Black people, I think I was probably hard to miss too. But it was at night. A car starts to slow. A floodlight comes upon us. It's the police. They want to know what we're up to. I immediately become a bit nervous. Uh, and then the first thing they say to Steve is that he's not treating his guests very well to make me walk such a long way to the house. They knew the house, his grandparents' house, and simply said, he can just hop in. We'll meet you there. And this way we can show some hospitality to our guests from America. And as they drove me to Steve's grandmother's house, they remarked on sort of how remarkable they thought America was, that you could be whatever you wanted to be, and that it had these principles of equality that they greatly admired. And they were also very happy to show their own sense of hospitality, and to show just kind of what they saw as their duties as police officers in the small Southeast England town. Now, this experience with the police was rather different from the one that I would have later, a year later, in Los Angeles. It was the summer of the what they called the LA riots. Rodney King had been brutally beaten by the police. The police officers had been acquitted, and with the acquittal came burning buildings, looting of businesses, and so I arrived about a month after the last building burned, and I figured I was probably safe. I was there on my Moorhead Kane fellowship at UNC Chapel Hill, and it was part of the summer experiences. And so I arrived there. We were staying just over the county line in Orange County, and just sort of almost right across from the beach. So I was in a very safe, very well protected area. But we would go in and do work with the LA Sheriff's Department. And one of the things that we did was for the cadet training, we were actors on a set. It was a back lot of one of the big studios, and the police would come out. There would be a scenario, and they would have to figure out what to do as cadets. And so I was assigned the role of informant, and my three white counterparts were two of them were the villains, and I had called the police in these scenarios to request assistance. The first few groups of cadets who came through, it was pretty standard. And then it all went downhill. The cadets arrived. I said, "Hello, I'm so glad you're here." I was immediately apprehended, put up against the wall, frisked, handcuffed, put into the back of the police car. And meanwhile, my white counterparts, who actually had a sort of a gun planted on their persons, were looking in amazement. Once the exercise ended, I looked at the captain and asked, and I amplified my Southern accent with the ask, is it usually the case that the person who's the informant is the one who was immediately frisked and put into a police car? He looked embarrassed and informed me that they had failed the exercise and it wasn't supposed to happen. And I think we both thought this wasn't supposed to happen, particularly because it was so close in time to the end of the riots, to discussions of police brutality and of racial injustices. And so I think we both assumed that everyone would be really primed to take greater care and not make these kinds of mistakes. And for any of you who have known me for any period of time, I really don't come across as in any way, I think, to most people, threatening. Now, why do I tell this story? I tell the story to indicate that lots was going on, and to try to think systematically about how can we know what was going on. The good experience happened in a very different country, different demographics, different history, small town. Um, the bad experience happened in a city a year later, and in a training exercise where they were primed to figure out where the villain was. And so there are lots of things about those two experiences that I can't compare systematically. But what we will see throughout this course is that there are other areas where we can do some systematic comparisons. And we want to do systematic comparisons in order to understand those things that are outside of us, that take hold of our lives. And the noted author and essayist James Baldwin understood that there were things outside of him as an individual that affected his life. In the 1960s, as Baldwin traveled through the South, he described what we think about as social structure this way. Quote, "You're at the mercy of something which has nothing to do with you, nothing to do with your ambitions, nothing to do with your loneliness, with your despair." And in this way, Baldwin enacts what C. Wright Mills called the sociological imagination. In the opening pages of his book, Mills reminds us how much our individual choices are dependent on things outside of ourselves. In this way, society is what is outside of the individual, the extra individual. And so we can imagine in this time of COVID-19 and discussions of police violence, that when the pandemic hit, the grocery store clerk became an essential worker. There were people who were suddenly unemployed, not because they couldn't work or because they chose to stop working, but because we were forced into isolation. There are other moments when people are forced not to work because of something happening with the stock market, what Mills calls the rate of investment going up or down, or classes rising or falling. And there are also these moments, and he talks about this moment, Mills talks about the moment of a war happening, in which the insurance salesman becomes a rocket launcher. A person changes his or her career, perhaps even career path, not because they have some idiosyncratic desire to do so, but because of something that's happening outside of their own life that compels them to make a different decision. And so here we find that there are working parents who have become homeschoolers, and as the death toll has risen, there are children now growing up without a mother, without a father. Neither the lives of these individuals nor the history of society where the pandemic struck can be understood without some understanding of both. And now we're going to talk about Karen. We've seen it over and over again, these memes making their way across Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, of a white woman named Karen calling the police on Black people who seem to her to be up to no good. And usually these are stories in which someone's barbecuing or doing something that's pretty mundane. And yet Karen has decided that they need to be very quickly apprehended and corrected. Now, imagine if your name is Karen. So if you're in your 50s or 60s, there's a good chance as a woman that you have the name Karen. Um, and we know this by looking at the Social Security Administration's database. We can look at baby names from year to year and see what the most popular names were and how the popularity of names rises and falls. We can also imagine that if you're born in this time, it is likely that you are not going to name your child. The person born now will not be named Karen. Uh, Parents don't want their child associated with a meme floating around Facebook. So why this discussion of names? What does it do for us as sociologists? And so one of the things that it does is it takes something that we typically think of as a very personal decision. You're naming your child, and it lets us know that there are patterns to it. By virtue of when you're born, you're going to be more or less likely to be named Karen. In the 1960, it was the fourth most popular name. In the year that I was born, it was the 15th most popular name. And by 2018, it fell to the rank of 635. So it was already on its way down. And we would anticipate that as we track the name of Karen, it would make an even stronger fall. Now, the things that we can do for names is a way of demonstrating that there are patterns out there that affect us. And so that we can track sort of rates or ranks of decline over time. We can do the same thing for our understanding of race. The sociologist Anne Morning, for example, back in 2018, decided to look at how race was discussed in biology textbooks between 1952 and 2002. She looked at the states with the largest populations of students, reading these textbooks, so she was able to get data on the textbooks used by about a third of the US high school age population. And what she found was that in the mid-century, biological or medical understandings of race were not presented in high school biology textbooks. By 1973 to the 82 period, this changed. And by 2002, race was largely discussed as genetics. And Morning warned that this would mean that genetic evidence is more likely to be marshaled to corroborate the existence of biological race than to demonstrate the opposite. So if race is a hard biological category, maybe we are all different, essentially different, the logic goes. And therefore, in this course, when we're talking about COVID-19, we're going to look at work by Professor Dalton Conley, who teaches here at Princeton, and Professor Alondra Nelson, who is at the Institute for Advanced Study and also appointed in the Sociology Department at Princeton, to ask how race gets misused in genomic research to make claims that the evidence doesn't support, and how DNA has a social life with important social consequences. And this becomes particularly relevant as different explanations are trotted out about why we're seeing racial inequalities and the effects of COVID-19. The other thing that we want to do as sociologists is just sort of check ourselves in terms of what we remember and why we remember it the way we do. And I say that in this time in which we typically think about the civil rights movement, and we assume that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was popular in his day. And he was, until he wasn't. As social scientists, we can look back at the Gallup polls and see what percentage of Americans had an unfavorable view of King. And it went from a low of 37% in 1963 to a high of 63% in 1966, where it remained for quite some time. And with all the talk about Congressman John Lewis, One would assume that most Americans were in support of the marches on behalf of civil rights at the time they happened. But that's not the case. The support came much later. In 1964, only 16% of Americans believed that the mass demonstrations by Blacks was likely to help the cause of racial equality. And this view was held by only 10% of whites and just over half of non-whites who were polled. Again, we think of the nonviolent tradition of the civil rights movement and we compare it to how that tradition is used today. We usually assume that the lack of support or support for the Black Lives Matter movement is only because the movements look really different. And we sometimes fail to grasp just how contingent that support is, and how we misremember how much support there was. Now, why do I do this? I do this to provide some context for the sense of chaos that was being experienced and at the time that Baldwin was writing. And so you will remember that in the 60s, when Baldwin's doing his work and talking about Harlem as an occupied territory, it was a time when death was everywhere. So just imagine the equivalent of seeing your activist leaders being murdered out in the open, kids being blown up at church, and even seeing the Democratic primary candidate killed just after winning big in the California and South Dakota primaries. When Baldwin is writing his report from occupied territory in 1966, it is already 3 years after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Medgar Evers, the civil rights leader, was gunned down in his driveway. Malcolm X was stabbed at the Audubon Ballroom. And this was only 2 years after the Civil Rights Act passed Congress. Baldwin wrote this report just a few years after Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley were killed in the church in which they worshiped early on a Sunday morning. The same day of the church bombing, 13-year-old Virgil Lamar Ware was shot by white teenagers while he was riding on the handlebars of his brother's bike. This was also the period in which Viola Gregg Liuzzo, a white housewife from Detroit, was shot by the Klan after leaving the protest at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So there was chaos everywhere. And more chaos was coming. And so it was a context of widespread racially targeted violence that Baldwin described Harlem as occupied territory. He saw that Harlem had been invaded, in his view, by a belligerent outside force and placed under police control. It was, in his description, a police occupation. And he could see then that more chaos was on its way. Now, it would be easy to talk about Baldwin's report from occupied territory as one officer encountering some young people on the streets of Harlem, and that officer acting out his own personal racism. But that's not what Baldwin wants us to do. These officers are not just bad apples in the bunch. Baldwin is cultivating a sociological imagination, making the distinction between individual taste for racism and overarching patterns and overarching forces shaping those tastes. Harlemites, by virtue of where they lived and how the police dominated them, could not rely on their individual good behavior to save them from harm. The taste for personal racism may indeed be idiosyncratic. Some people have it, some people don't. and those who have it can work on it if they like. But even those who don't personally believe in racist views can find themselves unknowingly replicating a racist pattern. How is it possible that people of goodwill can reproduce patterns that existed before they were born? What is it about our community rituals and our organizational rules that help drive those patterns? These are questions that we as sociologists ask as we modify Baldwin's view. So now what? Over the next 13 weeks, we're going to talk about police violence. And in our next lecture with conversation with Professor Andrew Papachristos at the University, Northwestern University, we're going to look at how we can use network analysis to see how violence spreads through policing networks and by virtue of the structure of those networks. We're also going to walk in the police officer's shoes and have a conversation with Professor Sierra Arevalo, who himself enrolled in police academy, observed a number of different police organizations across the country in order to understand how they live, how they're trained, and how they perceive violence in real time. We're going to run some experiments, see how experiments can be run in order to assess reactions to the Black Lives Matter movement. And then we'll move over to the COVID-19 pandemic and think about social effects on health and the outcomes of the pandemic, both in terms of health and in terms of the economic difficulties that have been wrought. We'll conclude the course back to Baldwin. And so by then, I hope that it becomes remarkably clear what the sociological imagination means, how Baldwin cultivated it in his own writings, and what we might do with it today. Welcome to the course.